Welcome everybody to IMAGI-NATION TV, and today we're having a special episode with Mark Carnegie and friends as we gather to question this idea of universal basic income. Now we can go back in time to periods in the 70s where this got to a topical arena in both government levels in America, started to be talked about in Australia. Actually, a fun fact which I found during the research around this was Martin Luther King, after his I Have a Dream speech for the 5 years following, was focused very much on the idea of a poor tax or a universal basic income. And his last big campaign was focused on bringing all the poor people of America to Washington, D.C. to set up a tent city to show everybody how they lived. And he was, in fact, assassinated a few weeks before that big push was meant to happen. Today, we've got Mark Carnegie co-hosting. Mark, how are you? We'll just grab you off mute for a second. Sorry about that one. Here we go. How are you?
I'm good and really happy to be here. And it was a surprising thing that you called me up to ask me about universal basic income only a week or two ago. So I'm very, very happy to be here. But trust me, I am the least qualified person to be talking about universal basic income on this panel.
Well, tell me a little bit about what brought you to it and a bit about your story for those that are watching who don't know much about you.
So, I'm essentially one of the filthy capitalists who is trying to figure out a way to reimagine capitalism to make it work in the new world, where unfortunately the internet's done a whole lot of really wonderful things for us, but it's also turned capitalism very much into a winner-take-all business, which means that a whole lot of people are not actually getting what I'd call a fair shake in the world. And we're looking for answers, I think, many of us, you as well as me, plus the people on the panel, about what to do about reimagining capitalism. Some other people who probably not on the panel want to throw capitalism away. I'm not one of those people. And one of, as you say, one of the persistent ideas that's been appealing both to people on the left and on the very far right has been the universal basic income. And, you'll hear today why it's such an appealing idea.
Miranda Stewart, can you tell us a little bit about your research and your work and what you've done around universal basic income, and wrap that all into a 2-minute bundle for us?
So I work on what are called taxes and transfers of social security, income payments to support people. And Australia has a well-established social security system, long-lived, developed through the 20th century. But our system is very targeted, very means-tested and targeted to the poorest, with strict kind of income and asset tests. So we did some research on what it would look like to remove some of those conditions or tests or restrictions on access to income support, which is what a UBI basically does. It's a more broad and universal payment with fewer restrictions and conditions. Could be on, working age people, could have conditions attached, or could just be completely general. And the reason why that's interesting is that there are features of the new economy, so Mark's mentioned that already, and possibly also just of our changing societies, not just technology, but more broadly, our ageing societies, our societies that are more worried about environmental sustainability and work, where it would seem that our current social security system doesn't really quite do what we want it to do. It doesn't provide complete security. It doesn't manage risks that people are facing these days. So we did some research to try to understand better what it would look like if we broadened that means-tested system to support individuals better through the kind of vicissitudes of life today.
And Karen Stenner, can you tell me a little bit about your worldview, where you've come from, and what lens you bring to universal basic income?
So my career sort of intersects across both academia and sort of business consulting to government service delivery. And as a scholar, I'm best known for my work on reducing racial intolerance, moral intolerance, looking at the rise of authoritarianism, intolerance of difference around the world, sort of the populist moments, Trump and Brexit, So while I've been interested in universal basic income for a long time, more recently I've been interested in the ways in which it intersects with my interest in social inclusion and social cohesion. So I'm a political psychologist by training. So while I do a lot of sort of behavioural economics work for government, and that's about the efficiency of service delivery, so that intersects with some of the things we'll talk about today, I'm sure. My major lens on this is thinking about universal basic income as almost like a fundamental human right, as a part of the social contract, that there's a basic level of income that you're entitled to, irrespective of your circumstances, irrespective of what other choices you make in life, regardless of the vicissitudes and whatever has happened to you. But there's a fundamental right to a certain sort of way of living that's supported by universal basic income. And
if we on that social contract idea, I think there's a John Rawls that spoke about a philosophical idea of a social contract. And when I think about economics as a framework, it feels like it's just a big open dome from which we then decide what the value is within and where we're going to place that value. John, can you tell us a little bit about your work at Grattan and leading a place that focuses on thinking? How do you look at a big policy shift idea like universal basic income and weigh up if, when, why, and would we ever look at proceeding into something like this?
Thanks, Jack, and thanks for the chance to be here today. So Grattan Institute has been running for about 11 and a bit years, and I've been there for all of those 11 years so far. And we look at policy issues primarily for Australia, but obviously when you kind of think through a policy issue like school education for Australia, often that's going to be equally useful in other places. And obviously things you can learn from overseas may be very useful for understanding how to think about things in Australia. I guess there's a couple of things that we've tended to bring to that policy work. One is show me the numbers. As someone in business once told me, in God he trusts, and everybody else provides the data. So we always try and kind of put bounds around things, try and understand what are the numbers, rather than just talking about things as theory. Just say, well, roughly speaking, how big is this? Doesn't mean you've got to get that accurate to 2 decimal places, but kind of getting a rough order of magnitude can be really helpful. And I think that's very true for this UBI discussion. The second thing that we tend to do when we look at policy issues is you always have to think about it as an all things considered judgment. It's not, it's terrific if everybody gets paid more through a universal basic income, but you also have to think through the two other critical issues that raises, which are essentially who is going to pay for it and how much will they have to pay. And then the second thing that you have to think about is if you have any kind of what we call taper rate, so that if your income is higher, you get less of the basic income, what kind of incentives does that create to work or not to work? So those are the three kind of things that we try and bring to this discussion. One is, will the payment be enough to live on? So that's a kind of adequacy issue. Secondly, will it be affordable? Basically, who's going to pay for it and how much are they going to pay? And then thirdly, what's it going to do to incentives to work? And thinking through how do all of those considerations interact, because obviously any time that you change the policy rules around any one of them, you affect the other two at the same time.
The third one's really fascinating, which is our relationship with work. We've got Frey and Osborne authored a report, which is one of the policy bedrocks that people have looked at around employment in the future, and particularly in the United States. And that was in 2013, it was published, and those guys are from Oxford, and they said that 49% of jobs are under critical threat in America in the next 10 to 20 years through automation. And you have one of the things that they proposed was that one of the few things that can't be automated is an original idea. Now, I was lucky enough to grow up with an artist who had billions of original ideas a day, and the journey into art and creation and expression, and we've seen it at different periods of flourishing civilization, that artists were creating not necessarily for work, but because it was a pursuit of ideas. We had different class systems where people were protected from work so they could be thinking for us all and advancing us. I'm fascinated by whether, Carmela, is there a world that we have 10 to 20 years from now where the Amazons of the world have cleaned up, retail and there's not actually jobs there, and we have mass unemployment. is there a world where we're not going to work, where some of us may never have a job in our life? And then how do we add identity into that world for people if we accept any of those presumptions along the way in that question?
Well, maybe, who knows? Whoever tries to predict the future is a fool, I think. But what we do know is that over history, we've always had people questioning, will technology make me lose my job? Will technology push me out of work? And so far, the answer has been no, not really. What it does do is it changes the type of work that you're doing. So what we can be sure of is the things that we're doing today in work are not the things that we will be doing tomorrow. And so something like a UBI or a social security net that doesn't have holes in it should be able to do is to allow people to transition from the work they're doing today to the work that they need to be doing tomorrow. And that's really the question I think that we should be focusing on.
Yeah, so how reimagining those jobs of tomorrow. And I was lucky enough to sit with Andrew Yang, who was a recent presidential candidate in New York about a year ago, just as he was kickstarting his campaign. And one of his fundamental beliefs was around UBI. And he listed that the five biggest employers in America, the top five are about to be munched up by tech in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So you have truck drivers, which was the one that really got me. So truck drivers are in the top 5 employment areas. And he said, look, driverless cars aren't about us and our safety. Driverless cars are about winning the truck industry so you can have automated trucks and win that huge game. We know Amazon been the biggest closures of retail, biggest closures of malls across America that we've ever seen. And the other one that got me was Google Assistant. So that we're losing admin, which is a huge, big workflow for us. So I agree that technology to an extent won't necessarily replace the jobs, but I don't know if we've ever seen it be munched up this quickly at scale. And now we're in a situation with COVID-19 where, Mark, you've started thinking about this a little bit. We're looking at pretty significant youth unemployment. And what does that mean to someone, to John's point earlier, to someone who doesn't have work in their life? What does it mean to your identity? Is there ways we can reimagine identity around a mass group of maybe 1 million plus young Australians that might be unemployed for the next couple of years as we try and rebound out of COVID-19?
So I think, Jack, you need to understand, if we were having this conversation at any other stage, John was really, really compelling as the anti-Yang. His point was, there's Andrew doing a very good job of raising these questions, but nothing in the data actually shows you that jobs are declining in the face of technology. As you saw before COVID-19, America's unemployment was at an unprecedentedly low rate rather than a high rate. So we had a case, I think, of Andrew, crying wolf a little too early. The reason why I wanted to re-engage in the UBI debate was I know John's views, which is it wasn't there in the data that technology was making people unemployed, but it's clearly in the data that people are unemployed as we speak today. And disproportionately, young people are going to be unemployed coming out of this lockdown. And so the question is, for me to get out of today on a 12 to 36 month basis, is instead of these interventions we've got at the moment in terms of JobKeeper, etc., is something that looks more like a UBI going to help all of the sort of readjustment of the workplace as we try and right the ship. Because my summary, Jack, is for the people who are listening as opposed to the people on the panel, my rough numbers are to save your grandparents, the government's run up a debt on your credit card that you don't even know of about $25,000 for every single Australian under 30 years old. So just so you understand, in addition to your HECS debt, you've got another one in terms of the amount of government debt that is there for your generation to pay off. And I'd be asking some questions if I was under 30 years old about what's going on here at the moment and how the intergenerational contract's actually going to work.
And Miranda, Carmela said you're a fool to predict the future. And I think many fools are forced into leadership positions and forced to wear an outfit where we have to try and predict the future. So unfortunately, it's the way we try and operate. When we look ahead and we think about this current model with job seeker, job keeper versus a UBI potential model for the next 2 to 3 years to try and support the transition, do you see value in that? Do you see no value in that?
I do see value in that. I think, so Carmela talked about what we would call structural adjustment, right? Shifting from major modes of one way of working to another across, whole populations. There's something much more specific that COVID-19 has shown us, and that is that a really large proportion of predominantly younger workers work in highly fluid, flexible, casual and risky work. Not everything's going to happen like COVID-19, where suddenly you can't go to the cafe or you can't go to a concert or artists can't produce, you can't perform. But clearly crises are going to keep happening, right? We tend to forget that it was in January that we were saying the bushfires were going to be the biggest thing ever happened to us this year, and now we've got this. So I guess my view is that we know now, actually, we don't have to wait to the future. We know now that life is more risky, and we know that our structures of work are less permanent and secure and stable than they were before. So employment is not delivering that level of security. And interestingly, the government's response to COVID-19, the job seeker payment, not just job keeper about trying to keep people in jobs, which has is probably a good thing, but has a lot of costs and risks, and I think definitely should be wound back quickly. But the job seeker payment increased the adequacy of basic New Start, which we've known for a long time has to happen, removes conditions, is supposed to be delivered immediately. Now, we know that's not happening, but that's partly because we've run down our social security systems in the last few years, and we need to improve them. And should we be able to form that function of managing that social risk, that economic and social risk. And in particular for young people and young artists, I just think it's such a shame that we don't provide adequate income support for further study or for creativity or for caring activity potentially is going to increase.
Even for the older artists, my partner's an artist and my sister-in-law's an artist. We're all living together at the moment, and they can't get the support of this current setup and how we value our art. So I think it's a central part of how we shape an economy, and where our artists land often, I feel like it shapes how imaginative we can be, to Carmela's point, around imagining what the future can look like. When we have a chance to engage with artists in the mainstream and we're being influenced by lots of different complex thinkers that go and do that imagining for us, then we get a different set of data. To what John was saying earlier, you can't necessarily put it in numbers, but my gosh, it can evoke experiences and mash things together and make you move. John, has the world changed for you, your worldview, when you're looking at COVID-19, and what the heck do we do now economically as we try and transition from here to tomorrow?
Well, obviously the world's changed immensely, and Grattan, we've completely changed what we thought we were going to be doing in January. The work we've done over the last 4 months and we'll do for the next 6, completely different, and that illustrates the way that lots of government decisions have been made differently. I think that we should be thinking about this fundamentally as, if you like, a cyclical shift, not a structural shift. There will no doubt be some structural shifts that come out of COVID. Many more people are going to work at home than used to in the long run. And by structural shifts, I mean things that are going to persist for a long time. Many more people are going to work at home. I think the reality is it will be very hard for any government to take job seeker back to the level that it was at. I would expect it will be pulled back from where it is now, but I don't think it's going to go all the way back to, in effect, 14, 15 grand a year. So there are some structural changes, but I think that also a lot of what's happening is fundamentally, if you like, short term, bearing in mind that the short term can go for a 3 or 4 year period as opposed to being a structural shift. And so the big challenge for government is essentially navigating the next 3 months, 6 months, 3 years. The next 3 months, they've got to essentially navigate their way, particularly in Australia, in terms of ensuring that COVID has been suppressed for the long term. That means that at least a goodly chunk of economic and social activity can go back. over the next 6 months, I've then got to try and get a lot of that restarted in a way that it doesn't allow COVID to come back, but also in a way that takes a whole bunch of businesses that have essentially been in, at best, suspension, and at worst, some of them have gone to the wall, and get them back up and running. And then over the next 2 or 3 years, they have to deal with the fact that those kind of effects do persist. We will have very high unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. We will have slower economic activity. We'll have not a lot of consumer confidence, not a lot of business confidence. We'll be in a world in which the rest of the world's economy is probably going to be doing even worse than Australia's on average. And this is, from an economic perspective, this is kind of worst case scenario, essentially, where all of the countries of the world see their economies turn down at exactly the same time. So that means that government's going to be faced with a really big challenge. They're going to be really strapped for money. At the same time, they're going to be under a lot of pressure to spend money to try and keep the economy going. They're also going to be under a lot of pressure because there's going to be a lot more people unemployed than normal. And so their big job is going to be essentially trying to get that economy moving again in something that kind of resembles normality, but with the additional challenge that there have been some structural shifts. We are probably going to see more people working from home. We are probably going to see more people ordering meals in rather than dining out, because they've kind of got used to doing that, and at least some of the time they'll do it more.
Or even more people. I think all of the seeds from Bunnings are now gone. So in a positive light, we've got people growing their own food. We've got a couple of chickens that just arrived, so hopefully the eggs are on the way. Hey, Karen, what do we do for that group that are going to be facing big unemployment? We've got a question that's come in from the chat line, which I'll throw to you in a second, and just to read out some of the feedback. Will having a UBI increase our happiness index? Maybe if we freed up from work, as we know it, we'll be able to create new industries. That's from Steph Beck. Charlie McKenzie said, my job didn't even exist when I was a kid. I'm so interested to see what's to come. And we've got Brad Witters, I think from Armidale, saying, has something like COVID-19 made us more aware of the collective and its importance with a focus on local business? Now will we start to see society look at the importance of the little man and how we collectively build those policies? What's your views on that, Karen?
I definitely see this as a moment for a significant sort of reorientation of our attitudes towards the roles that different people are playing in society and what we owe them as a collective. And the idea, of moving away from social welfare as like this very punitive, disciplinary sort of means of control that is foisted upon the undeserving poor, to the idea that there's just a basic fundamental human right to a certain level of well-being, i.e. income. And also sort of disconnecting work from people's other pursuits, in the sense that, and this will be true coming out of the pandemic, that people will have discovered things that they're much more passionate about than their jobs. And one of the beauties for me of universal basic income is it liberates people from the necessity of paying their bills, and allows those people who would like to sort of sit still for a while and think about the big questions in life, or create art, or innovate, and so forth. And it gives those people the leeway to take the time to do that if they choose, without cutting off sort of everyone else's, desire to be in the workforce and work traditional jobs. So I like how it also removes like the permanent underclass, which was something that shocked me when I moved back to Australia from the US, which I hadn't seen before I left in the early 90s, this idea that there's a whole section of society that's permanently stuck in an underclass. So I think that having a universal basic income is kind of a new social contract that we should definitely be moving towards as we're coming out of the pandemic and as the climate change risks heat up, that, that we're all in this together, that we have collective rights and responsibilities, and that it's not just every man for himself in late stage capitalism. And that using universal basic income as a means of social cohesion, which has many benefits beyond the economic, and from my point of view, the most important being sort of increasing tolerance, increasing feelings of inclusion and cohesion, sort of reorienting people to the idea of collective responsibility, and helping capitalism work better while you're doing it. So it's not a threat to capitalism, it actually makes capitalism work better. And in particular, these being sort of straight cash transfers that people don't have the opportunity to choose how they spend, I think is really important to sort of increasing dignity and self-respect, all of which are really important things which are necessary to thrive and succeed. So people won't take chances, people won't sort of try out their ideas, basically if they don't have confidence in themselves, and they won't be able to do that unless they have the, the risks around that sort of partly mitigated by universal basic income. So I think as we move into the technological age, as we move past climate change and pandemic, it creates a society that allows people to make freer choices about how they spend their time. And the things that don't immediately have a financial return, but may 2 decades down the track, people are liberated to do that. So we can't properly factor that into our calculations at first.
Yeah, that point and that idea of investing in imagination or investing in the creative space, you know, when we think about 1 million unemployed people, young people potentially coming out of COVID-19, I'd love to work with them to be the creative generation for 3 years and say, all right, we'll gather 4 organisations in Australia. Let's get together with the Defence Force, the Foundation for Young Australians, with 5 or 6 other organisations, and let's mobilise the greatest period of invention that Australia's ever seen. And let's set challenges and assignments and coding, and let's just look at this space, which would be, because I think the challenge is if we put an imprint onto a group of people that say, you're unemployed because of a pandemic for 3 years, and you lose that self-worth during age 18 to 21 or 22, you don't have anything to talk about, you don't have a purpose to get out of bed, we're going to lose momentum during those really key formative years. And I know personally, I started AIM when I was 19, and it was a time when I wanted to change the planet. That's when our spirit and energy, and you don't have fear, and you're kind of just starting to learn a bit about the world, but you're still, I suppose, you don't know enough to be afraid of changing things. You're like, oh, I can just go for it. So you kind of have that interesting balance, and seizing that moment of a young generation, I think will be a critical piece for us to try and be able to solve. Miranda, how do we pay for a universal basic income?
Good question. And I know it's a question on John's mind as well. And Mark also referred to this sort of massive debt on young people following COVID-19. Now, there isn't a direct debt. You should remember that government debt is paid for out of future taxes at some point, right? So that's sort of the budgeting process. You do need to pay for it. And one of the reasons why no country has ever really done a basic income. There's various experiments and experience in a few countries and proposals, as you pointed out, Jack, in the past, is because we have this sort of political negotiation we have to do among our current population, the working population, people who own their homes, retired people who have retirement savings, and these, the bright young things, and the future young people. And one could pay for an adequate basic income, let's say at the current sort of COVID rate of New Start, add that few $1,000s to it, make it slightly more livable. But it would require a sort of effective tax rate on labour income of the working population of more than 50%, sort of from the first dollar. So our modelling sort of suggests that in order to fund that without deterring the work incentives or actually just to get agreement, right, of the working population to something like that, we would also need potentially to tax wealth or consumption better than we do. So we don't want to put all the burden on those who are working in the formal capitalist economy. We need to actually spread that burden. But it does cost in the hundreds of billions of dollars to deliver this, and we still want to deliver childcare, education, health, affordable housing, infrastructure. So we've got to balance those things in our political negotiation.
I think it's fascinating, this current moment, because those that are suited to operate in a technological world, business is going pretty well. This is a good time for your Amazons of the world. This is a good time for Google. There's never been more hours watched on YouTube. Netflix is in a good spot. We've been lucky to save ourselves by pivoting to this platform and operating in this arena. And there's almost a short-term period of time where we're playing it out, where we've got people that are going to work because they've got work that is available, and then a lot of people that can't go to work because of COVID-19 putting this sort of breaker on it. So we almost have two worlds operating right now. Because I like practical solutions, none of you are getting off the hook with just coming up with the theoretical challenges or the opportunities. I want to know, you're advising the Prime Minister on a phone call after this. What are your 3 steps for after the 3 months, assuming COVID's under control economically? What are your pieces of advice, 1, 2, 3, looking at what are we going to do around this significant unemployment, and where should we move from job seeker, and is UBI part of that? that conversation. So Carmela, the Prime Minister's calling. What's your 3 tips for him as the next steps?
Oh, that's a great question. So I suppose once we've moved past the stage where we are trying actively to shut down the economy to protect people's health, and it is safe to start opening the economy back up, that's where you want to start looking at trying to stimulate demand. And what that means is you want people to be out in shops, you want people to be working again, you want that activity to start coming back. So really what the Prime Minister should be focusing on that stage is your sort of traditional stimulus. So you're thinking about things like social housing, or if you're talking about the UBI space, looking at paying a higher rate of welfare than we normally would. So I suppose those are the sorts of things that I would be pointing towards, looking at, investing in infrastructure, getting government expenditure out there, while also making sure that you're providing adequate welfare for the people who are still unemployed.
Miranda, you've had a bit of a lead on doing this research. What's with taking in the factors on the run, and I know it's not going to be peer reviewed, and we're not going to be able to publish the paper. But your 3 tips, if the Prime Minister calls right now, what the heck do I do, Miranda, after 3 months from now economically?
Well, the first thing I would say is that job seeker, not in its current form exactly, it's a bit odd, but I do think we need to maintain, and into the future, not just in the next year or 2, into the future, a less conditional and slightly less means tested and more adequate income support payment. And the government also needs to really invest in that social security administrative capability, because a key that we need to provide security and deal with risk is to be able to turn this payment around quickly, right? We need a highly responsive and flexible government, just as we've been demanding a responsive and flexible workforce. So that would be a priority. I also think that we want to support in particular, women back into work, and we want to invest in childcare. So there are some other forms of provision, public provision, investing in young people in education and investing in childcare as well, I think is a good thing to do. Both of those things cost money. So my 3rd recommendation would be that the government has to take seriously the idea of tax reform. And what I would want to see there is not so much lowering tax rates on top earners, but lowering the tax rates on low to moderate earners on their wages, and increasing our taxes somewhat on stocks of wealth and on consumption. You've got to be careful because of the issue of business stimulus. It's incremental, but that's what I would be recommending.
Sounds pretty well thought out, and you've done a bit of work behind the scenes on that one. Karen, 3 tips, Prime Minister's calling. What would you say?
I can't get my mind off the political aspects of it, and obviously that's going to be critical in terms of generating, widespread support for the significant structural changes we need to make. So what I've been thinking most about is how, it's a once in a century kind of opportunity to reorient ourselves in regard to a number of really pressing problems that were coming to a head. Mitigating climate change, dealing with the pandemic, intolerance, populism, authoritarianism, attitudes towards immigrants, etc. Massive and increasing social inequality. I would want to be talking to the Prime Minister about how to package a solution that addresses all of that and gives people a sense of a larger we, sort of a larger us, and the set of critical problems that society needs to solve in order for free societies to continue and to prosper. So Mark knows that I'm way down the spectrum of this being a fundamental threat to liberal democracy. And so I really do think this is about repairing the system in a really fundamental way. And I think that there's no way that happens unless you have the government itself and politicians on both sides of parties understanding the problem as understanding this as a unique opportunity to make very significant structural change, and simply reorienting people entirely around sort of renewables, public health is a critical investment. I agree with, all the arguments about investing in high quality education, high quality, often work-based childcare, so they're close by, things which facilitate women coming back into the workforce. All of those ideas that we have about not wasting human capital, and I think that that's what we're doing now. So in addition to demeaning and reducing the dignity and respect of a large chunk of our citizenry, we're not basically taking best advantage of human capital. We're so focused on making widgets now in the here and now that we're not thinking about all of the potential that people have if they can stop thinking about how they can even get the fare to ride the bus to their part-time sort of ephemeral job. That if you permit people to sort of if you remove from those kinds of considerations, they can basically bring their whole sort of capital to bear in terms of the things that they're capable of doing. And we're not making use of the skills and talents and aspirations and passions of half of the population. And so that's not something you can sort of see coming out as an immediate financial return for this massive investment that we're doing with the pandemic. But definitely, if when you cut costs, when you look at costs and benefits properly, not just the concrete, tangible things in the here and now, investments in high quality childcare and education, in good quality public health, universal healthcare, et cetera, all of those things have enormous returns over the long haul.
And education is a fascinating one to jump on. We're well and truly in that field, working between high schools and universities, and watching and thinking about where we've landed right now. The current model, broadly based, is inherited from a Prussian system a couple of centuries ago, and we've followed. We've made innovations within the frames, but we've sort of followed a reasonably similar set of train tracks, at least in Australia and the United States and a lot of the Western countries. We now have this complete flip that's happened overnight, where you have teachers teaching 6 hours a day in a classroom that kids are the experts in. You've never had a world like that. So whether you're marginalised or within the mainstream, you suddenly know more about the arena that we're teaching within. There's all of these mass experimentations that are happening right now, which I also agree would be a huge mistake if we wasted this window to reorganise. I think you could potentially have a world where homeschooling is part of our experience 1 day a week. Schools are flex, workplaces are flex, and we maybe have the kids at home for 1 day. And then you could have less kids in the school, which New South Wales government's experimenting with now around social distancing, saying, well, we're going to bring in kids into school for 1 day throughout the week, and then we'll have less kids so we can have more social distancing. What that also achieves is smaller class sizes and an ability to tailor learning to kids who are either outside the margins or who are doing extremely well. And so there's a huge opportunity for reorganisation because we're setting precedents, and there's that phrase that precedence is 9/10 of the law. John, the Prime Minister's calling. 3 tips. Let's go.
So my first tip, Prime Minister, is to listen to all the things that you've been told by Miranda, Carmela and Karen around increasing the rate and reducing the conditions of job seeker, and stimulating the economy through building more social housing, and dealing with all the disincentives that our childcare system creates, and dealing with the authoritarianism and all of the issues that that's causing. So Prime Minister, that's my first and most important tip, because I'm only going to add to things around that. My second tip is, Prime Minister, you've got a big problem with trust in government. It's been falling for a long time. For a whole series of reasons. But the first is that people think that government is being run for a few big interests rather than in the public interest. And the second is big cultural divides, particularly between those with higher levels of education and those with less education. So, Prime Minister, I would also be trying to solve those problems, because unless you solve those problems, you're going to really struggle to get people to buy into all the other things that Miranda and Carmela and Karen have been talking about. Particularly if you're trying to get at least 10 million Australians to download an app that they might be somewhat suspicious of, a wee bit more trust in government would be kind of helpful. So the things that you might be able to do that will help that are, first, do what you say and say what you do. That's always a good place to start. But there is a significant amount of concern about the political process, and so looking at how political parties are funded, how elections are being funded, putting limits on campaign spending, making it much more transparent, and perhaps putting a lot more limits on what kind of jobs parliamentarians do, and particularly ministers do as soon as they've left Parliament. That whole kind of suite of institutional reforms, it's not going to be the only thing that improves public confidence in government, but it will sure help. The second thing that you're going to need to do is to start taking seriously expertise again. I note that Prime Minister, 6 months ago, you were busy telling public servants that their job was to implement whatever bright ideas the government had. And now every decision you're making is being justified on the basis that it's following expert advice. So, Prime Minister, that's good. It's a lot of progress in 6 months, but you might want to keep doing that after this crisis is over. And so rather than denigrating the public service and reducing its capability, you might want to be deliberately building more institutions that are independent of the minister of the day, that have the ability to kind of talk in public about what they think would be good ideas and can build a public support base. And then thirdly, Prime Minister, you're going to need to worry about this cultural divide. And it's obviously not only a cultural divide between higher education and lower education. This created a lot of divides, one of them between the old and the young. And so how can you do that? And essentially that's language of, that's going to be difficult, Prime Minister, because you're used to talking the language of economics and the language of culture. It's the language of arts, of sport, of all of those kinds of things. And you're going to need to find ways to talk more about those. You'll probably need to invest more in those. Good news, actually, in the scheme of things, they're quite cheap. But we do need a more sophisticated system for encouraging art, encouraging public conversation about it, around sport and so on, that ensures those things that are supported, particularly because those things have been more badly affected by COVID than anything else. The first thing that we shut down and the last thing that we will reopen is live sport and live entertainment. And yet those are incredibly important pieces of cultural glue. And so you're going to need to think about how do you create other kinds of glue that substitute for those in a world where, you know, we don't have live sport, we don't have live art. And, you know, those things online are all very well, but they're really not quite the same.
Mark, the Prime Minister's calling. You're 1, 2, 3. Where are we going economically?
So my number one is you're going to get 100,000 people asking for something, and you should put them in a different door to the people who are telling you that actually they want to give you something. The best experience in circumstances like this was the American Business Roundtable after the Second World War, who came to Washington at that stage and said, we've made so much money out of the war that the only way we're going to reconstruct the economy is by having higher taxes for 3, 4 or 5 years to fund putting the economy back together. Now, no one has had a good COVID-19, but you've got to be hearing what people are prepared to give rather than what they want to get out of these circumstances. And anybody who says, this is what I want in my own self-interest, you should put them at the back of the queue. And the people at the front of the queue should be the people who say, actually, overall, over the last 10 years, we've done well out of the world, and it's now our time disproportionately to give back in. So I think one of the things that I believe very much, and I've been on this for a while, is the wealth tax, which essentially the Prime Minister managed to get elected by saying, I'm not going to provide a wealth tax, has to come back in. So that'd be number one. Number two really goes to what you're saying, Jack, in a different way, which is, Prime Minister, you have between 1.3 and 5 million people years of employment amongst the young of Australia. That is, in a way that you did not expect, you were going to have between 1.3, 1 and 2 million people unemployed for between 1 and 3 years. And your legacy, Australia's competitive position in the world, is the challenges that are given to them to actually think about how they engage in the world and in society to make a productive contribution rather than feel alienated at the end of this time. So you need to come up with what are the things that people can be proud of engaging in the world over the next 1, 2 or 3 years, where if you don't do something to capture their imagination, they're going to feel alienated. And there's a phrase called scarring, which is at some point, if you're stuck in a situation where you can't get traditional employment and you just get the door slammed in your face again and again, you get dispirited, and your capacity to re-engage in the world is really, really poor. So you've got between 1.2 and 5 million years of people's work that you can engage in them any way you like, because you're already paying for them, and you're going to be paying for them between 1 and 3 years in JobKeeper or Job Seeker. So you might as well find some way to challenge their imagination, get them to be engaged in actually making a better Australia and a better society. So that would be my second one. And then my third would be, you need to think about what you're saying about Australia's engagement with the world coming out of this, because nobody wants to speak to the fact that because we have effectively made COVID-19 extinct in Australia and the rest of the world has pursued it in different ways, but I would say sort of it is out in the other communities, you've got to explain to people how you are going to take advantage of our relative good fortune and not be in a situation where we start a little, stop a little, start a little, stop a little, and therefore a good outcome in the first round ends up being a disastrous outcome in the second, third, and fourth. And you need to explain to people how they're going to do that. And just one thing, Jack, I saw on the feed, it's for a different day, but rattling around in all of this at the moment is another idea that people might have heard of called modern monetary theory. And there are a constituency of people, none on the panel, who believe in that. And at some level or other, the world's got to think about just exactly how it's planning to deal with that, because that is going to be a huge, huge component of what goes into the policy mix, but has not been discussed today.
Mark, thank you. And in terms of number two, and I think number two and number three, I can have a crack at. Number one's probably up for someone else. So number three, why don't we try get back together and do a conversation around modern monetary thinking and pull together some people and look at what that could look like. Number two, I just believe in a world of trying to solve problems, no matter how intractable they seem. When we started working and facing Indigenous disadvantage and educational disadvantage with AIM 16 years ago, I was lucky enough to grow up as an Aboriginal person. My mum's Aboriginal, and we grew up, between these two worlds of people who had opportunities, and a lot of my family who hadn't had those opportunities. And I just felt like if we kept telling the same narrative, then we were going to have the same result. If we kept telling a narrative of permanent disadvantage, we were going to keep having that same result. And we've been able to, in a lot of ways, shift what seemed like one of Australia's most intractable social challenges at scale now for 20,000 Indigenous kids to achieve educational parity and beyond by focusing on the narrative arc and focusing on the psychological stories that we're telling about what's possible and where we can go to. So I would love to, outside of this call, see if we might be able to have a look at number two, which is, with this group of young people, potentially 1 to 5 million people, we've been able to mobilise volunteers at university level for 16 years and know this generation very well. And I think there's a line that what happens, evil prevails when good people choose to do nothing. So we'll put our hands up and say we'll try and be a part of a collective that can help go to the Prime Minister and provide solutions as well. And I think that's all of our jobs. It's not just on the Prime Minister to come up with the solutions and us to identify the problems. Let's try and go together. And that's when we build a strong collective democracy. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming on the show. Karen, Miranda, Carmela, John, Mark, thank you for engaging in complex conversation. I think this is what makes democracies work. And I want to see a country in Australia that embraces the grey space and where we can come together across all ages and all cultures and engage in any level of ideas. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
All good.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Let's solve
number two.
We'll solve number two in the next couple of weeks. Hey? We'll just get a memo to the PM and we'll have that one sorted. And then number three, modern monetary thinking. I have no idea what that looks like. So I look forward to the next show on that one. Thanks to Mark and the Carnegie crew for helping bring this together today. And we'll be back at noon today for a catch up with the youngsters for Imagination TV. And we're going to finish today's segment with our little play at trying to work out how you can pull an economic lever. So a couple of weeks ago, when we were looking at 2 million people facing rental challenges, we looked at how we could take one of our key products and turn it into a social enterprise. So we created this hoodie that pays rent. and this hoodie that mentors kids. And 50% of the hoodie goes towards hoodie connectors who are struggling to be able to pay their rent. So you may be familiar with the big issue model of a social enterprise for homeless people. We looked at whether we could do this with a hoodie. So we've had hundreds of people apply to be hoodie connectors across South Africa, Australia, and in different places around the world. And we've raised $20,000 to date. So if you want to grab a hoodie that pays rent, head to aimmentoring.com to support our work and support the 2 million plus Australians struggling to pay rent at the moment. And we'll finish today's episode with a short video about this hoodie pays rent. Thank you for joining us on Imagination TV. We'll be back at noon for a catch up. Thanks again to our guests, to Karen, to Mark, to John, to Miranda and Carmela. And we'll see you all at lunchtime for a catch up with the youngsters.